So it's an interesting question. Am I in balance? Some people would say, am I centered? Am I at home? So finding balance is investigating, contemplating, what is my view? What is my worldview? And what is my motivation for this life? Is my motivation actually consistent with my worldview? And then coming down to a little bit more focus, what is my intention? Like, what is my intention today or this week? You know, and is that in accord with my motivation for my whole life? Are those things in balance? So I think we can see this kind of balance reflected in natural systems where there is that kind of balance.
Windhorse Farm is probably the oldest example of sustainable forestry in Canada. These lands were originally settled by the Wentzell family in 1840. Right from the beginning, they had a very clear ethic about how to care for the land, both in their agricultural practices as well as in how they cared for the forest. The forests, other than what they needed for farming, were actually never cleared. The last generation of Wentzells didn't have any children of their own and were getting too old to care for the place, and they faced the tough choice of having to sell the property. And that's where Jim and Margaret Drescher came in. They offered to continue this model of sustainability. They took over the farm and followed a lot of the same practices that the Wentzells had used. And they brought in some of their own wisdom as well in terms of organic farming and ecological-based forestry.
Well, this is kind of a special tree. I mean, all trees are special, but this one is unusually special. I imagine that it has some kind of protector function here at the gateway to the forest.
Jim and I met in 1976, and he was from Colorado, and I had been living in California and was living there in Berkeley, part of a meditation group. He was sort of doing an international coordination of a project and looking for volunteers. And I was sort of the feminist sitting in the back of the room with my pink vest on and sort of looking at this really handsome, smart, interesting, charismatic man at the front of the room thinking, I better get out of here. I don't want to fall in love. And almost as soon as I thought of that, he said, so is there anybody who would like to coordinate the household for this visitor? And I found my hand shooting up, and he said, great, that's wonderful. Would you like to get together and talk about that? So that was the beginning of what now, it's been a 36-year-old romance.
He's a lot of fun to work with at $3,000 a minute.
When I met Jim, he was a businessman, and I was kind of a hippie feminist, and not finding anything there that was really satisfying my desire for a personal change or social change. When I discovered meditation practice, it was something I really resonated with, and then to find a man in my life who also resonated with that, it was just love at first sight. And slowly we went from meeting and eventually moving to Colorado to study with the same teacher, and continuing with my horticultural practices as a gardener and a horticultural consultant, learning more about different ecosystems, and then moved to Nova Scotia in 1979 with Jim. And he slowly started to morph more from business person into development, and really very strongly connected with what was going on in Nova Scotia. In particular, gravitated to the forest. And in 1990, we both found ourselves walking through the forest of the Wentzell farm and forest. And walking through the forest and the fields here, we both looked at each other, and it was sort of like we had fallen in love with each other. It was love at first sight. But when we both looked at Windhorse Farm, that again was that magical moment of falling in love. And that was it. And I always say when I hear of people leaving their marriages or having affairs or whatever, I always think how wonderful that I never had to do that, because I have gone through so many changes in my life with this particular person.
I grew up in southwestern Wisconsin, but I spent my summers in Colorado, or a lot of the summer, every summer in Colorado. And that's when I first started to see destructive logging practices. Whole mountainsides stripped. This would have been in the 50s. And that was devastating to me. And then when I studied ecology in school, before ecology was a common term, and then I went out to graduate school at the University of Washington, and that's where I really encountered incredibly destructive logging practices. But that was a time when I think my kind of patience and accommodation and gentleness reached a real low. It was a time of real aggression at wanting to right the wrongs of the industrial society. And of course that was also a time politically in the United States during the Vietnam War, when everything about the mainstream U.S. society seemed upside down. The environmental policies, the political policy, the blatant warmongering, social injustice. There was a lot to be pissed off about. That's what I thought. And going back now and reading some of my poetry from then, it's kind of shocking to me how intolerant, aggressive I was. So it's an interesting question. What were the forests of North America like before the time of the European invasion? they certainly were not unaffected by human beings. The human beings that were here were forest people in this place, in the Acadian forest. There's considerable evidence that maybe close to 500,000 people that lived here. After the Europeans came, most of those people were killed or died of disease, and the way people related to the forest changed completely. Rather than being an environment in which people lived respectfully, gently, fearlessly, the European settlers seems like they had a lot of fear, a lot of confusion, fear and other kinds of confusion, and the forests started to be liquidated. The methods that people had for cutting down the forests were, by today's standards, rather old-fashioned and slow. That forest degradation happened slowly and steadily over 300 years or more, until the time of the really, I suppose, the advent of the chainsaw, the time of the Second World War. And since that time, the forests of Nova Scotia have been liquidated very, very rapidly. The situation isn't hopeless. The rich forests of the Acadian forest could be restored with a real change in view. And probably within 500 years we could restore a lot of the richness and beauty of the Acadian forest. Nature is incredibly resilient, and beauty is everywhere. Richness and abundance, diversity is here. It's certainly not that everything has been ruined. Well, one of the really spectacular things about springtime is the dawn chorus. That every morning, especially in the springtime, just when it starts to get light, all of the songbirds are just going nuts. They're all singing as loud and as fast as they can. And it's just a beautiful cacophony of bird song. And at this time of year, I always like to be awake and out in the forest, or particularly at edges and wetlands. The dawn chorus is really loud and beautiful. And of course the spring peepers are a big part of the chorus, and they start in the evening, but they're still going in the morning. So they're just tailing off their concert about the time that all of the songbirds come in and start singing. We think of it as a mating time and a courtship time for the birds, which is kind of the love side of it. But then there's also the power side of it, which is the territoriality. That a lot of these birds rigorously defend their territory against any intruders. Well, spring in the forest is the most magical time. There's a lot of incredible things about it, and one that I really love, there are 108 different shades of green, and all of them are really completely vibrant. And then about this time of year, everything starts to bloom. Like all along the river down here is a shad bush. And the genus is Ameliorating, but they call it shad bush around here because when it blooms, it's the time for the shad to run up the river and spawn. It seems like every shrub and every perennial, herbaceous perennial, is in flower. It's not really true because it just keeps on this way until late in July. But this is the time of year when there's just so much vibrant color from flowers, as well as the vibrancy of the different greens.
If you can see all the way over to the hillside behind you, there's probably an acre. And when we moved here, this was just a hayfield all around the house. So what you'll see are all of the plants that have naturalized themselves or have been planted in the last 21 years. So these huge locusts, quite tall, these are 10 years old. These are wonderful trees that are used for fence posts when they're a little bit smaller, and when they get larger, they can be used for decking. All of the gardens along here have been planted as a permaculture planting to sort of buffer the noise and the dust and so on from the road, and provide some fruits, vegetables, and it's just thriving with bees and moths, butterflies. And then through the first gate, down into the garden. On the left, we have something called brush walls, which are fences. And then all sorts of things like grape and kiwi, various vegetation that are both edible and ornamental, grow up on them. And then it creates this marvelous little habitat, this welcoming for the reptiles, the mammals, all the different animals that are coming to be our biological controls for the gardens. Inside, we've created these little microclimates. You could grow basil and eggplant and tomato and all the heat-loving plants. They love being over on the north side because they get all of that sunlight and heat. For years we grew peaches and almost felt tropical in there. It was so warm.
One of the things that's unusual about Windhorse Farm, didn't used to be unusual in Nova Scotia when there were only Mi'kmaq people here, but is the silent season. So for April and May is what we call a silent season. A season that was honored by the Mi'kmaq people in this place for a long time. And it's a time when we don't take any machinery, chainsaws or tractor, anything that would make a lot of noise into the forest. It's the time when a lot of the birds are mating and nesting. And the deer are having their fawns. It actually changes our patterns as well, because we know it's silent season, and so something different happens with us in that season too. We spend a lot of time wandering around, sitting in the forest, sleeping there at night, watching what's happening in a quiet way.
There are two arteries that come down from the forest, and one is called the Willow Brook or the Willow Creek, and that's over to the north side of the gardens. And over to the south side is the Sweetwater Creek. They all join together in a beaver pond. Then these kind of chaotic wetlands in the front, which are where the beavers and the muskrat and all sorts of animals have made a habitat, and it's very kind of wild. When we first moved here, the Wentzells filled in all of the wetlands down below so that they could use all of the land in front of the farmhouse for growing crops. But we found that we were missing something in terms of the ecological diversity. So we have spent the last 23 years and just really restoring the natural diversity of the waterways here. When we have rocks that come from the garden, we replace the rocks back into the creek, so there are places for the fish to lay their eggs. And it has been an invitation to many more birds and reptilian, amphibians, mammals have all come to these gardens because they have a place to live where they can be nourished.
My interest in gardening and horticulture goes right back to the beginning. I remember being under a hydrangea bush when I was 3 years old, with flowers that just seemed enormous. Just taking them apart and playing with them. And then it just continued through the rest of my life. My mother loved gardens, she loved flowers, she loved fresh vegetables and fruits and herbs, and she took me to every farmer's market, and we'd go to botanical gardens and out into the national parks. It sort of culminated for me when I started to study horticulture and sort of formalized my education around it. And there I studied ornamental horticulture and landscape design. So when I came to Windhorse Farm, it was really fruitional for me. I came into an open landscape where I could really grow as much as I wanted to. This garden has been built in a truly organic way. When we moved here, this was just one big open hay meadow, and it went all the way from the house down to the river. The storms in the winter would be coming from the north, and so the winds and the cold would be really coming in from that direction. So we did a permaculture build out where we did berms and coniferous trees, and we tried to protect the north shoulder. So we've created a bit of a bowl, both human intervention and just naturally working with what is already here. And then there's some sort of emotional elements that have been brought in, like a tree that was planted on the placenta of my daughter and a grandchild. And then sometimes it would just be like a bird would deposit a seed of an apple tree, and then suddenly we have an apple tree. So some of it came with intention, and some of it just came by serendipity. It's not too tight, and it's also not too loose. There's the chaos and there's the order. And all of those are invited into this garden, and I think what makes it very unique. We've never ever used any pesticides here, herbicides, insecticides, because our philosophy is just invite everybody in. Invite the mosquitoes that are kind of bugging me right now, but live with them because they have their place in nature. So it's a wonderful foil for the carrot rust to have a mixture of plants so the carrot fly cannot determine, as they could in a monoculture, where the carrots are. So the gardens are my main teacher. They have taught me how to look, how to smell, how to taste, how to touch. There's constant wake-up happening in the garden, birds flitting through. The planting techniques, disease control, all aspects of horticulture have been revealed to me basically through being in the garden. You can do so much of working with what is already natural in terms of landform, but then it takes off on its own, and that's where the magic begins.
When I first came to Windhorse Farm, it was really at a point in my life when I was just getting ready to set out on my own. Really trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life. I had this long-standing passion for nature and the outdoors. I was looking for something that was in accord with what I had always experienced as being the health and sort of vibrancy of the forest since I was a child. It's something I experienced right from a really young age. Looking around, the world around me, I grew up in Montreal, right in the middle of a big city, and now Montreal's a fun city, but seeing how far away the forest was from that city and how much of an impact we had, and then moving to Nova Scotia and in this province, just the blatant, obvious, just clear cutting of the forest and over cutting of the forest, just total destruction actually of the natural world, and being quite keenly aware of both the damage that was being caused and the human disconnection from nature. That was something, I think, because I had such a strong connection to nature since I was a kid. I could see quite keenly in others how far removed they were from nature. And so I really wanted to work in the forest, work with the natural world, but I couldn't be part of a system that was destroying it. So I was a bit of a ski bum and, adrenaline junkie, going out and mountain biking, but there was something sort of a little bit off about that too, where it wasn't totally connected with nature and kind of grounded in a real sense of being with the forest. I had actually met Jim and Margaret Drescher at a Buddhist program earlier that year, and at that time Jim invited me to come here as an intern. I said, oh well, sure, I'll consider that sometime, but wasn't going to go for it, and after a few months painting floors, realizing that I was wasting my time, I called up Jim and asked if I could come. And he was sort of quiet on the phone for a little bit, and he said, well, could you come tomorrow? And kind of laughed, but within a few days I think I had managed to quit my job and pack things up and moved into this cabin in the middle of the woods. Living in these cabins was also just a big part of the experience. They're pretty rustic cabins. No electricity, no running water. Mostly not even insulated. So you can imagine living in a woods camp like this through the winter had its challenges, but I'd say I actually kind of grew to love the challenge. It actually just creates a different rhythm of life. You have to draw your water. You work by oil lamp. I came to Windhorse Farm really motivated by a desire to learn how to work in the forest, how to be in nature and care for nature. Pretty quickly, and right alongside that, I discovered that there was a path of practice and a set of teachings that was really, really in accord with actually how I experienced the forest, how I experienced nature. Studying those books really became a core part of my time. I would wake up extra early. I was already getting up early to do chores, to spend an hour in meditation as the beginning of every day, and closed every day with more practice. To be honest, I was probably the only one of my friends who cared about the forest or noticed what was happening to the forest. If you asked them, of course they would say, oh, those clear cuts are terrible, but they didn't feel it in a sort of the way that I felt it. It was a calling for me. There was something that was sort of profoundly wrong in what I was seeing.
I think this kind of activity, which is all too common, is somehow a result of human beings not being connected with nature, not realizing the interdependent aspects of all plants and animals, including humans. This is pulpwood, fairly poor quality pulpwood. The ecological value of being here is huge. The economic value of taking it to the mill is minuscule. I don't know whether the owner would net anything from this. The cost of cutting it and trucking it may be greater than than its value at the mill. You're seeing the destruction of the habitat for thousands of species of animals that are being just stripped of their food and housing by the really the ignorant activities of human beings. It's sad. And I say ignorant not in a blame sense, because it's really a cultural problem. It's in our culture we just have not emphasized what our relationship is to the rest of the natural world.
For me, it's always the feeling of kind of like, almost feels sort of hollow. Like, even though, you can hear birds and around the edges, even at a kind of a superficial level, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Even in conventional forestry terms, if you look at the species that were cut and the age of the trees, they liquidated this stand just as it was starting to get productive again. Probably the best thing that happened here is that somebody had a few weeks of work. And people are pretty desperate for work, I guess, but...
And in forestry, what's driving the forestry of this province is companies from other places. They're not Nova Scotian companies even. But the forestry policy is dictated, I don't think that's too strong a word, is dictated by the foreign pulp companies.
Well, and you want to speak about disconnection too, because it's not even the pulp companies, because if you face the pulp companies directly on things like this, then they pass the blame to, well, our shareholders demand that we do this kind of thing. And well, who are the shareholders? It's sort of like we have this system now where nobody who ultimately has to take responsibility for this, nobody has to walk onto this land and look at this destruction and say, I'm responsible for this. We've got a whole structure to allow ourselves to kind of pass the buck and wash our hands of any sense of connection or any sense of responsibility for this place.
Yeah.
So the training here was pretty interesting. I hadn't actually realized or necessarily given much thought to the fact that I was going to be learning how to log with horses.
You don't realize it, but you're about to go up to the pasture. It's where you want to be.
First few times that I had to work around the horses and put the harness on them, they terrified me. big, strong animals. Easy to. It was a totally new experience for me. You think about a draft horse and what they can do, and yet as you work around horses, the gentleness that they have is pretty mind-blowing, and forgiveness too. And yet here they were being patient with some pimply-faced kid learning how to work with them. I remember actually Peter Churchill, the guy who taught us how to horse log here. He talks about working with horses and when you're holding the reins, and he describes it as perfect tension. That the horse has to know you're there and to know that you're in control. But if you're too tight, the horse is gonna react to that and pull back. But if you're too loose, they're gonna take advantage. They actually are really good for logging and especially selection harvesting. A horse can move through the woods with a lot of flexibility, can get around places. I'd say working with horses in the forest and logging, we got a lot of work done, and it's probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever done in my life.
Yeah. All right, Ted. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, go! Go on! Go on! Ted, well, you know, Ted's been here. He's been here for more than 15 years. And he's 32. It's pretty old for a horse. And when Ted came here, the night he came, he almost died. He was about 300 pounds lighter than he is now. He had been starved and beaten, and he was on his way to the slaughterhouse. And he came here, and he was so freaked out that he wouldn't let anybody get near him. And I think horses in general are very forgiving animals, and Ted is definitely incredibly lovable. He got used to it. He gained trust. He's a good friend. He was a logging horse here for about 14 years, and for the last 3 years he's been retired. He's up there with Cody, who's a younger mare, a quarter horse, that is here really for them to keep each other company.
I met Jim Drescher actually at Fallsbrook Centre, and I live in New Brunswick beside Fallsbrook Centre, and as part of the Forest Stewardship Initiative, they were trying to get standards on good forestry practices across the Maritimes, and took an eco-forestry course after that with him at Windhorse Farm, and loved the place. Windhorse as a place to be captured my heart at that point. I loved being in the woods, just the majesty of these well taken care of woods. So I learned that from him that a lot of... You hear a bird, yes. A lot of the things that were within me from when I was a child, like a certain connection that I had with trees, I felt we have an ability to communicate. Those things seemed natural and seemed actually part of what ecoforestry was about. It's not just about techniques and knowing your species and all that stuff, which is also very important, but it was also very much fostering your heart connection with the forest and the forest animals, the forest species, beings that were all around, and I really appreciated that. I loved his way of putting words in a fearless combinations. I've really enjoyed that.
Well, I think in terms of forest practice that the first part of forest practice, and maybe the most important because it's kind of the doorway into really deep connection, is relaxation. So relaxing in the forest is really easy for me. I think it's good to relax anywhere, everywhere, all the time. But for me, it's particularly easy in the forest. And in any way, you know, sometimes we say, stand like a tree, sit like a frog, lie down like a rotting log. So whatever posture it is, that just relaxing, letting go. Like, well, there's so many nice places in this forest for napping. This is one. soft moss. Rotting log is a perfect teacher. Just lies there, available to the bacteria and the fungi and the worms and the salamanders and the bears.
And my mom at the time said, farmers work sun up to sundown. You're ready to work that hard? And I said, oh yes, definitely. I loved the fact that there was a working farm. They had cows at the time, so I'd go down and help with chores in the morning and taking care of the chickens. I loved all their gardens. So in many ways it was a place that had a lot of fruition for my own endeavors that I'd like to see happen wherever I live someday. At that point I was still a bit more transient. Well, we were in sort of this environmental era, you know, the Earth Summit, and I really took that to heart. So there was a lot of things even coming through the main media saying, you know, we should care for our Earth. I wanted to know where my food was coming from. I wanted to grow it myself. I wanted to get my hands in the soil. And Margaret, learning from her an astuteness of the landscaped world, as well as how do you incorporate your family into your endeavors. Someone who speaks earnestly and listens attentively with her heart, and just wonderful to be with. And I did take environmental science as my education, and yet it was so removed from the realness of just feeling the soil with my hands. And from that point I didn't want to change that. I wanted to always be able to feel the soil with my hands, not read about the soil. But somehow that was downgraded. You know, I hope that now, as our society moves forward, that should be more and more recognized, because emotions can pick up much more readily, I feel, truth than countless studies, you know, where we're trying to be objective. So my main goal in taking environmental science, and I hated it at times, was to learn the terminology so that I could just as easily peruse through an academic journal and see if it had any validity in it as, you know, reading about Shambhala Buddhism.
Often as scientists, I'm a recovering scientist myself, and as scientists we want to think about things. We want to figure things out. We want to analyze things. So when we look at complexity, we want to somehow analyze it. And maybe we can't actually do that. Maybe that our brains are not powerful enough to analyze and understand complexity. But we have a much subtler and more refined system than thinking, and it's actually feeling. And a great forester from Maine one time said that not only are forests more complex than we think, but forests are more complex than we can think, but they're not more complex than we can feel. Knowing before we think about it. The Acadian forest is a transition zone between the northeast hardwoods and the boreal forest. In any transition zone, I mean, it's an edge. You often have greater diversity at the edge. So it's very diverse in tree species and in all other plant species and animal species. There are tens of thousands of species of plants and animals that live in the Acadian forest. Well, they live in this very thin layer on the earth between the tops of the tallest trees and the depth of the deepest roots. That's just a tiny, thin layer on the Earth. But almost all of the species diversity is within that thin layer. So intuitively we could say if that thin layer is a little bit thicker, then there's actually more opportunity for plants and animals to live there. If this layer is 150 feet thick, there's just a lot more opportunity than if it's 30 feet thick. There are species that live in the tall trees that don't live on the ground.
Jim actually really encouraged me to practice in the forest. So doing what I had actually always done probably all my life was going out into the forest and finding those places where you could just sit down and experience nature and really bringing to that a meditation practice and awareness practice that completely expanded the scope of what I was witnessing. Exploring the forest, finding those places, as hesitating to use the word a little bit, but it's like there are power spots in the forest. There are places that just kind of magnetize your energy and the energy of the environment around you, and sitting in those places and bringing your good intention, your open heart to those places, they allowed for a connection to nature that really sort of illuminated not only my own personal practice and sense of compassion for the world and connection to others, but also illuminated an understanding of just what it meant to care for the forest. Knowing how to meditate in the forest is what makes me a good logger. Having that connection to the forest and to the environment means I know how to pick the right tree to cut. And that's a confidence and an understanding that is born out of practice. And it's born out of skill and knowing when it's time to cut a tree, how to run that chainsaw properly and fell the tree safely and cut it efficiently and get the wood out. It's this really interesting balance between a working world and a practice world. There's actually no separation between those two things, and I think that might have been hard even for some of the people who came here. They came here with ideals about what they were going to encounter. And then asking them to cut down a tree seemed like the wrong thing to do. Like they had a really hard time. Isn't that wrong? You're supposed to hug the trees, not cut them.
If you're going to manage this forest for total ecological diversity, what would you do? You could probably would say, well, how could I possibly do that? There's a million parameters of ecological diversity. Most important parameters are canopy height, canopy closure, and dead wood. Then we have to add one more parameter, which is connectivity. And connectivity is the characteristic of a forest that allows the migration of animals and the dispersal of plants. because of the industrial forestry paradigm, it's starting to fragment the system and lose connectivity and lose species. Dead wood is the life of the forest. It's a little bit counterintuitive. There's literally more life in a dead tree than there is in a live tree. Almost half of all the animals that live in the Acadian forest live in or on or from dead wood. Standing dead wood is extremely important. A lot of animals can live in standing dead wood, snags, dead trees, that can't live in them after they fall down. Leaning trees are important. Piles of brush are important. Large rotting logs are important. One of the important things that the forest at Windhorse is deficient is in coarse woody debris, because we harvest some big trees. The ones that we take out and saw into lumber will never be rotting logs in the forest. We try to ameliorate that damage. But call it what it is. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that whatever we're doing in the forest, we're causing damage. We don't want to go into denial and say what I'm doing is not hurting the forest or that it's beneficial or something. That's ridiculous. But to recognize the effects that we have and then try to ameliorate them. One of the ways we do that is to saw our logs in the forest, and that the slab wood then stays in the forest, the sawdust stays in the forest. The only thing that comes out is the lumber. The slab wood in this forest is used in building roads. We build slab wood to fill the hollows, and then sawdust and shavings over the top of that. We have over 20 kilometers of those trails that a team of horses or a tractor can travel on. And those roads themselves, since they're made of slab wood and sawdust, are long corridors of decomposing wood. So they're habitat in themselves. They're functioning in nutrient and water cycling. When we don't need any more slab wood for roads, we use that slab wood to build what we call slab walls, which are long rows of these slab through the forest. We're hoping that all of the animals and plants pretend that these slab walls, as they decompose, are in fact large rotting logs. They're full of redback salamanders and snakes. So we're going to take, in any group of trees where we feel something is offered, we're going to take the slowest growing tree in that group. And then once we cut the tree down, we want to figure out what part of this tree has a high dollar to biomass ratio. And that's the part we're going to take out and make products out of. And what parts have a relatively low dollar to biomass ratio, and those we're going to leave in the forest.
The gardens here really are a legacy that Margaret Drescher has brought to the world.
Where did you come from? Who are you? That's some cherry.
When we first started growing our own gardens, we were really focused on food production. And so being at Windhorse and having to tend the perennial gardens, a lot of them are flowers. And it seems like every time I go into the garden, there's new smells. There's a new flower that's poked its head up and blossomed, and so I'm learning a lot about the flowers.
I work with flowers every day, and I'm completely magnetized by them. I'm so in it that I can't even stand outside of it from a scientific perspective as a botanist. Flowers' job is to magnetize. That's what a flower does. They're magnetizing this great swarm of bees that I'm looking at. The bees come from our hives, and they come from the wild bees, and there's zillions of insects, and they're all in there gathering nectar. So flowers are a way that our world continues itself. It's how evolution evolves. So that's supposedly the purpose of a flower. And yet the most beautiful thing you could offer to somebody is a flower. Flowers have their many, many different facets and purposes, and we as human beings only know a very small reason for why these things exist. The daisy has always been my favorite flower. I named my daughter Marguerite, which is what daisy, the common name in French. And I like it because it looks like the sun. It has a center of gold, and it has all of the rays of the sun there. And the sun obviously has a great importance to us as human beings, and particularly as a gardener. The sun is my friend.
Now I have 3 kids. Really, I've come back because of them. It's really coming back, being with the Dreschers. The Dreschers are now grandparents, and so we're creating for a little window of time, enjoying doing meaningful work, working in the gardens, but at the same time being in a space with people that are in a different life path. I have children that are, awake and experiencing life, and they're often, pulling me back to say, look at this, take time,
Wave to the trees.
See what we're seeing. My 1-year-old is listening to the sounds at the top of the trees, and in the morning she'll be out there with her hands up in the air, and she'll be, speaking in her own language, but to the tops of the trees, I'm not sure if it's to the birds or if it's the leaves rustling, but she seems to have this connection, and I'm like, wow, and all I can do is imitate, because I think it's so wonderful. But I think if we're in a place like this, whether it's here or whether it's back home in New Brunswick, I want to keep that experience for them as much as possible. Because whatever the future holds, whether you have a disastrous view or a hopeful view, I think we'll always need good food to eat, we'll always need clean air, we'll always need clean water. They're gaining skills and relationships that are going to serve them in the long term. Yes, Naomi.
Can I go pick sweet ferns?
Yes, of course. My daughter. She's picking herbs right now for teas, and she's enjoying it.
See all the honey in there. It's shiny. Honeybees are pollinators. They're one of many species of pollinators, but they're the domestic ones. So caring for the pollinators is really an important thing for us to do all together. Pollinators are somewhat endangered because of general environmental degradation, and they're responsible for pollinating most of the flowering plants in the forest and in the gardens. So the loss of pollinators would be devastating for the food supply for the human population, but also just in terms of nature altogether, that the pollinators are really a key link in biodiversity. And so we can care for the bees, and we're caring for the forest and the natural landscape altogether. Also, just caring for the bees is caring for the bees. So this is another way that we can relate to non-human beings respectfully and with care. This is a really exciting day because the bees are flying, and they're flying out to the black locust. The black locust just started blooming yesterday, and it's one of the strongest honey crops we have. They get a tremendous amount of pollen from the black locust. So they're all endangered by the chemicals that we use in our forests and our fields.
Taken.
Another thing is biological engineering. You know, just in some cases, insecticides are actually built into the genetics of corn or soybeans or canola. And so when the bees go to pollinate those plants, they pick up the insecticide, and so that kills them. In many cases, beekeeping has become part of the industrial agricultural paradigm. So you have beekeepers with thousands and thousands of beehives, moving them around on trucks. So their whole system is weakened by those stresses.
They memorize the location of their hive. Maybe this tree and how it looks. There's some drones in there.
Mm-hmm. Squirt a little smoke in here. Just a little bit.
You know, what we could do is if we went into a bigger box, we could leave those that are there, transfer them over, and then maybe put 2 more frames of uncapped brood.
Mm-hmm.
Or that
So maybe we could get from here.
Well, this one's interesting because
Oh, this has the laying queen.
the queen that wasn't laying, and I haven't checked her.
Yeah.
So,
Well, maybe we'll put this back together and go in there and check.
okay.
Well, let's go on down to
All the profusion of berries everywhere. Nice.
Bees are feasting on these blackberries, blackberry blossoms.
Steepest learning curves for me was about, rather than feeding the plant, you feed the soil. There's a natural interdependence in a community of life that is taking place that does its own thing. Mostly, I've been inspired by Fukuoka, who was a Japanese gardener on the South Island of Japan, who did something called natural farming. And a big part of his philosophy was hands off. Let it be what it is naturally, and it will take care of itself. So we are in the midst of a drought here at Windhorse Farm. Afraid for it. We feel something's radically shifting. It wasn't this way when we came here 22 years ago, but it's clearly a drought. It hasn't rained in a couple of weeks. The creeks are dry, the wells are dry, we're not watering anymore.
We're quite sure it's due to global warming.
And when we did water, we watered just new seeds that went into the ground. But it's quite lush in its flowers and its the trees and the shrubs and the grass. And I think it's because of the natural ecosystem that exists here. The mulch of the plants, the ground is covered, the soil is covered here with plant life. I think that's what accounts for the incredible jungle-like environment that we're in. And at the same time, there's enough sun that penetrates that canopy. Sustainability through diversity arises again and again.
In restoring forests that have been abused, the key technique is to slow the water. This forest is one of the main places where the water coming from the clouds going to the ocean is slowed down. As those drops are coming out of the clouds, they hit the highest branches and canopy. They drip down to a lower canopy, and onto this moss, and soak into the ground. And since the water is the lifeblood of the forest, the longer it's here and the more it's cycling within plants and animals that are here, the richer and healthier and more abundant the system is. Then that starts to teach us about management practices. If we're clear-cutting this forest, then what we're doing in effect with the water cycle is we're speeding up the water. We're speeding up the flow of the water from the clouds to the ocean. And that's going to result in hugely reduced richness or reduced diversity and abundance of life. So if one of our objectives in caring for forests is to increase that wealth and healthiness of a forest, then one of the key things is that we have to keep the water in the forest for a longer period of time. This is perfect for the forest floor, this kind of mossy sponge. A lot of dead wood, which the decomposing dead wood holds a lot of moisture. It's dry right now, but if we were to walk over to that dead log over there and reach our hand in, we would actually find that it's, and we could squeeze the water out of it. It holds that much water. We have a lot of other water features. So we have what we call here treed swamps. They're basically areas that are wet most of the year, have standing water much of the year. Trees don't grow very big there because their roots are all in kind of water. So when they grow up a little bit, they fall over. And in those wetlands, of course, that water, most of that water is seeping into the ground and then comes out in the streams as seeps. Because everything in the landscape is part of some watershed. So if you look at where the water courses are, the seasonal and year-round water courses, they're actually the bones of the forest. It's not these lines and quarter sections and straight lines that define property boundaries. The landscape doesn't go along with those at all, but is really configured in watersheds. One of the really important things to do is restore all the wetlands and quit draining swamps and quit blowing up beaver ponds and quit tile draining in agricultural land. All of those things are things that speed up the water, which is exactly the opposite of what we need to do for really enriching this world.
I think many of the young people who were coming here were people who were looking for themselves in nature. They were looking for the land and wanting to do something practical. So many of them were well educated from a conventional perspective, academically, university students, college students, vocational training, but they all were I think heartsick in a certain way. They all wanted to change the world. And so many of them had some kind of a spiritual yearning. They wanted to connect with their heart and found something had separated them from their own sense of well-being and their own sense of goodness. It's another way of knowing. And that's something that you can't learn anywhere other than being in nature.
I had come back from Ontario, being with my mom. My folks were going through a divorce, and there was a lot of pain and guilt and whatnot within the family dynamics. And so when I got back to Nova Scotia, I really felt like that home place was only now a memory. I had been to this hemlock cabin or hut several times throughout the fall with Jim, and felt a really deep connection with this place. These huge hemlock trees and the forest floor supporting all this regeneration of new life. It felt like the perfect place to give up all of my stuff and bring in some new energy and some new sense of home. And I came out 2 days before the full moon and then stayed through for a few days after the full moon, protected by a tarp over this structure here. So I was fairly windproof and protected from the elements. I've often described it to friends as, sorting out your soul. And I think after a certain amount of time, when you're fasting and if you've done the appropriate preparation, you sort of forget to worry about those things. They don't become problems for you. You're just in this other space between spaces, perhaps. I'm not sure exactly what to call it. Days and nights run together and not really knowing which is which at times. Just being here in this awesome, quiet And, you know, if I felt like crying, I could cry, and if I wanted to yell, I could yell, and if I just wanted to be silent and listen, I could do that too. There was no rules or anyone guiding me other than my own intentions. So that was very freeing. I don't remember being afraid. I remember, listening for sounds and wondering, ooh, I wonder what that is. Especially at night when everything tends to go to sleep, but then the night critters come outside. And again, I think that's part of the process of kind of being in that different kind of space. I would hear footsteps around the hut here in the night especially. I would hear owls. There were a couple different kinds at least. The one that is the most interesting is those big screech owls. They would have this wild sound. And hearing the coyotes howling and knowing they're just on the other side of the tarp. Probably very curious about what I was doing under this big blue tarp in the middle of the woods. Also knowing that I'm in this safe place. This is my home. Nothing's going to happen to me here. So sort of abandoning the thoughts of fear and not allowing that to really take over. And as my days rolled on, the last really early in the morning I was up before the sunrise, and I could hear the footsteps approaching. And I knew it was the coyotes coming back, and they were sort of dancing around the hut. They were all clustered and walking around the hut, prancing around. And in that wiggly tree right there came this big owl. And so as I was collecting my things and gathering up stuff, I remember really feeling like this sense of, rebirth. Okay, so now you have the chance to do whatever you want to do in your life. This sort of inner voice saying, you get a second chance and you can heal those wounds. It was such a deep thing that it sits really tight in me to this day, and I imagine it always will. I know that I really can make a difference to this world. And that I can help other people too to experience those things.
One of the things I hear from a lot of people that come here is that this is a healing place. And it has definitely been that way for me. When Margaret and I came here 22 years ago, it was at a time when I was in a lot of pain, psychological pain, and I spent a lot of time in the forest. And I do have the feeling that the forest healed me. And I still feel that way. Whenever I come here, I feel I kind of bathed in the energy of this place. This summer there was a real drought, and so mushrooms just didn't fruit. And now we've had some rain, and the mushrooms are like up all over the forest. There's a huge abundance of mushrooms, great diversity. And this is the first opportunity they've had this year, as the rains didn't come in July and August, but when the rains started coming in September, the mushrooms got their chance. The mushroom we see is really just the fruiting body of a huge organism, networks of organisms known as mycelia, and they're all under the ground in the forest. And really it's the connectivity, it's the connective web of life in the forest. Connects things physically and in terms of the nutrient, in terms of the whole kind of physiology of the forest is very much connected through the mycelia.
This forest is sort of interesting. You can think of it actually as being maybe even close to 12,000 years old, really forming after the retreat of the last glaciers. The whole succession of plants growing and gradually building up soil on the bedrock, and the mixing of the minerals and parent material of the bedrock, creating the right conditions, and it really all leads to producing this type of forest. And we have to be really careful if we think we can change that or tinker with it in any way. I think you have to be pretty bold to mark a tree that's almost 10 times as old as you are. Red spruce as a species in this forest is kind of interesting. It's a long-lived species. It's shade tolerant, so it really grows well in these sort of old growth forest conditions. It can grow incredibly tall and straight, and red spruce on average, I mean really in an old growth forest, red spruce can live to be more than 300 years old. For the East Coast forests, that's a pretty long-lived species. The red spruce that we were harvesting was of a sort of size and quality that really not very many people have anymore. And we started to find out that size red spruce in particular as a species is probably one of the most valuable tone woods for the soundboard of a guitar in the whole world. And that's really coming out of a history for red spruce, which dates back to the sort of the 1930s Martin guitar era, which really kind of shaped the sound of American folk music. During the Second World War, a lot of the forests in the Adirondacks and the sort of northeastern United States and eastern part of Canada, a lot of forests were really heavily cut. And basically after the war, there were no red spruce big enough to make tone wood, to make guitar tops anymore. Within this 10-acre area, I may have found 3 or 4 trees, individual trees that will make a guitar top. Of those trees, I'm ready to harvest one of them. So I've decided to cut this tree because it actually, well, it's time. It's not even so much a question of its chronological age, it's much more about its physiological age. The tree is losing its vigor. The needles are starting to thin out, and there's not much crown left up there. It's a sign this tree has slowed down and it's on its way out. Really, if we're going to cut anything in the forest, making sure that we're really using that material well and using it to its highest end product is kind of our responsibility. Making musical instruments out of the wood we cut is probably the best scenario you can come up with. this is kind of neat here. Stump of a tree we harvested and got some nice little red spruce seedlings growing right on top of the stump. And I bet 300 years from now one of those seedlings will maybe be making guitar tops. Part of our grading process is to assess the tonal properties of each top. Each top is unique, and the way the sound moves through each top is unique. Cool. I love this one. Nicknamed the Phoenix.
So we've had a pretty good honey year this year, I think. So we got some splits and they all did really well, so we're set up pretty well for going into the winter. Don't you feel rich with all this liquid gold pouring out of the tank? I think this is real wealth. Well, my grandmother kept bees and my father kept bees, and neither one of them ever sold any honey. They said that honey was much too valuable to sell. So they kept it to give to their friends.
Fall. This has got to be the second wind. Nature completely takes over at the end, and it's just like the end of a fireworks display where kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. It's really a time of celebration and appreciation. I think many of us feel such gratitude that the Earth's bounty has been given to us.
So fall is a time of high energy. It's also a time of ripening and a time of dying. The annual plants are dying, the perennial plants are dying back, trees are losing their leaves. Everything is getting ready for a long time of quiet in the winter. Time when many of the birds are departing for parts south. It's a time when the harvest of food, a lot of the food harvest comes in the fall. The root cellars get full. The pantry gets filled up. And the energy of the people is kind of getting ready for winter. A lot of energy with the people, a lot of hard work. The mornings are cool. Physical labor this time of year is just keeping warm. beds need to be prepared, cover crops planted, and all of the kind of loose ends need to be tied up, because pretty soon there's going to be snow covering the ground, and then whatever gets buried will stay buried until spring. There is a little bit of sadness that the bright, energetic green days of summer are ending. And I suppose there's also a reflection on one's own life, the autumn of one's own life. I feel that at my age. But it's not a sadness that is a negative sadness. It's a sadness that is kind of a full-hearted sadness. The result of letting go is that you discover a bank of self-existing energy that is always available to you, beyond any circumstance. It actually comes from nowhere, but is always there. It is the energy of basic goodness. This self-existing energy is called Windhorse in the Shambhala teachings. When you contact the energy of Windhorse, you can actually let go of worrying about your own state of mind, and you can begin to think of others. The warrior who experiences Windhorse feels the joy and sorrow of love in everything he does. He feels hot and cold, sweet and sour simultaneously. Whether things go well or things go badly, whether there is success or failure, he feels sad and delighted at once.
So this morning I saw the eagles who nest in the beautiful 100-year-old pines across the mouth of the river there, flying over the lake and then coming in over the gardens and over the forest. And I was reflecting on the changes that are going on at Windhorse Farm and sort of having that kind of perspective. That there's something deeply spiritual about this place, and that really informs how I am here and how I relate to other people and relate to the land, and then hopefully some little bit of that will be transmitted, and it will become like the bees here. It will go out and pollinate other communities. When you first begin a spiritual journey and you're sort of learning the theory and the principles of a teaching, it kind of comes in on a head level, and it slowly come much further down into my heart and into my bones of what it is to really be a spiritual person, which is much more the kind of caring for all people equally. Everyone's got their story, and there are many different ways of being kind. So I think maybe living on the land and watching crop failures and crop successes in different weather conditions has been part of my learning in that way. For many, many years I've had a retreat practice here. In the winter time, sometimes I've taken very long retreats here on the land in a little house out in the wilderness. All of the inputs that are usually in my life, and there are many, it's a very busy and vibrant place here at Windhorse Farm. And sometimes I just really need to go away and really check in with myself about where I'm at and how I feel and what I'm not. I started studying with a Buddhist meditation teacher in 1973. And I really wasn't looking for a Buddhist teacher, and I really wasn't looking for a teacher, but people told me that what I was attempting to do, which was called meditation, and I might want to connect with a meditation teacher. Trungpa Rinpoche, a Tibetan master, his personal practice had brought him into a state of profundity and intelligence and creativity and compassion that I had never seen expressed in a human being before. So it was quite shocking and revealing to me that that was a possibility for all of us. Well, a very great teacher who visited Windhorse Farm came into this retreat house, and one of my neighbors was here, and she had never really considered the idea of retreat. It just, to her, seemed like, gosh, why would you go into retreat? That's like leaving your family. And, you know, a few different approaches were coming up for her. One was like, that seems very selfish and kind of self-indulgent to go. And also there was a little bit of scariness of like, what will I find when I get in there? Maybe I'm not going to have so much fun with myself. And this teacher said, the reason that you go into retreat is so that you can come out. And that sums it up for me. If I'm not appreciating myself and understanding how I work, then I think that that's going to show up in my relationships with the people closest to me and also the organizations that I work with. Learning you have the capacity of facing your own difficulties and the suffering that you might have in your life or the fears, and seeing that you have the capacity to move from there is a very powerful part of building your own personal strength and understanding, and builds your compassion for other people and things that they might be working with. A big part of my practice now is outside the cabin and on the land. The principles of the teachings that I've been studying for 40 years have sort of dropped away, the conceptual part of it, and it's beginning to show itself in the phenomena here, in the crunchy snow and the brilliant sun. Just being on the land has taught me so much.